Specialist. Heard Saturday mornings at 7 on AM 560, The Answer.
If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy, as we know and discussed many a time on this program, radical environmentalism is not about science, and it's not about the planet. It's an ideology in search of power. But it is worth taking the time to try to provide some tutorials for people to help them better understand how the energy economy actually works, so you don't get wooed by the utopian pablum of an AOC, for example. And City Journal from the Manhattan Institute put together a little 8-minute video narrated by our friend John Stossel on this this week where we celebrate Earth Day. However,
don't we celebrate it all month now?
To get people interested enough to even pay attention. Earth Hour, Earth Day, Earth Week, Earth Month, Earth Year. AOC's GND is junk science and junk economics. Stossel talking to Mark Mills and others at Mark Mills from the Manhattan Institute and others about just sort of basics here to inform your economic understanding.
You're talking about zero carbon emissions, no use of fossil fuels.
That is the goal.
That's a goal you could only imagine possible if you have no idea how the energy economy works or how energy is produced in this country.
James Meigs, former editor of Popular Mechanics, says the Green New Deal is just not feasible.
Renewable is especially hard because it's so inconsistent.
Because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine.
You can't just put in wind turbines and solar panels. You also have to build all this infrastructure to connect them with energy consumers, possibly very far away. And you always need some kind of backup power.
For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Phillip Magness. He is a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research and the author of numerous works on economic history, taxation, education policy in the United States, and the like. Phillip, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So we've been treated to a lot in this space this week because of these manufactured Memorial Days like Earth Day. AOC's GND, and now at the local level, you have aspirants for national political office like New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, taking her theory and trying to apply it locally, for example, banning glass and steel skyscrapers as de Blasio proposed this week.
Yeah.
So just in terms of where you think this goes, what the response should be to all of those Democrat presidential candidates, as well as those who might be like a de Blasio, who have signed on in some form or fashion to the AOC fairy tale about green energy.
Right. So the critique I would make of this type of policy in general is it's basically an ideology in search of a justification. And we see this carrying out historically, that if you go back 100 years, environmentalists more or less had the same policy solutions, but they're prescribing them to almost exactly opposite conditions in the world that they faced at the time. So big example is mid-century, they came up with this idea known as peak oil, and the premise is that fossil fuel is a finite resource in the world that's going to deplete over time. Eventually, we don't know exactly how much oil we have left in the planet, but the idea was that once it depletes, once it hits a kind of a point of no return, you'll have a decline in oil production, and therefore it initiates a worldwide economic energy crisis because there's no more oil to basically fuel the modern economy. So the prescriptions that they came up with were all of the same things that we hear about today. We need to subsidize alternative fuel sources. We need to regulate oil to restrict its use. We need taxation to deter people from having cars that are not fuel efficient, things like that. So it's all these same policies that are very familiar, but they're argued from almost the exact opposite perspective. It's to prevent this depletion event that they thought was imminent. And it turns out, here we are 60, 70 years later, the depletion has not occurred, even though they were all predicting it would take place around the early 2000s. So the depletion has not occurred. And in fact, oil extraction and oil efficiency technology have improved to the point that we vastly extended the ability of this resource to last us many, many decades into the future. But their policies haven't changed. Now they're saying that we have too much oil and we have to keep it in the ground because of climate change. So they offer this argument called carbon sequestration, which is to intentionally prevent people from using oil and other fossil fuel sources for their energy base, but they come back to the same policies. We need to regulate it out of existence. We need taxation now on carbon. We need subsidies for wind and solar. So it's just this recurring cycle of the same policies offered for very, very different events.
Well, I wanted to ask
tells me
you.
that it's more.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I want to ask you about, alternative energy and wind and solar energy. Do they really, do what they're claiming to generate? I mean, is it actually working? Because they're ruining our tapestry. You can drive anywhere, whether it's in California or on I-55 in Illinois, and these wind farms are popping up everywhere.
Yeah, they're absolutely hideous to see. So there is kind of that social downside of these giant towers scattered across the plains or scattered across our mountains. But the interesting thing on wind and solar is their output is a tiny, minuscule portion of the energy production of our economy. I mean, I've seen estimates, they say that's 1 to 2% of energy comes from these two sources, and yet we're dumping all sorts of public resources into it to kind of subsidize it and prop it up and supposedly make it cheaper compared to all these other alternatives. And the interesting thing of these public resources, when they're expended on solar and when they're expended on wind, the companies that are invested in solar and wind become stakeholders in the political game. And what do? They turn around and they lobby for more and more and more subsidies.
In your piece on the topic, you make a parallel argument to the minimum wage debate. What's that parallel?
Right. So if you go back to the 1930s, when the minimum wage really starts to pop into the policy scene, when it's put forth as part of the New Deal, one of the things that was argued as a justification in favor of it, and this is from a very different time socially, there's racial prejudice all around, but they tried to sell it to segregated white labor unions, saying that, hey, we'll raise your wages, and in doing so, we'll price black competition out of the labor market. So it's this discriminatory policy, and we know this economically from the laws of supply and demand. If you raise wages and do it through the force of law, you basically create a labor surplus relative to what companies are willing to employ. And the first people that would get cut out of that surplus are effectively, minorities, mostly immigrants and African Americans. When they were targeting this, and they said they pitched this to the white labor unions and said, "Look, we've got your back. We're going to ensure that all the work goes to you in the middle of the Depression, and not the African Americans, not these other immigrants and other populations that are kind of looked down upon by society and discriminated against." So they argued in favor of the minimum wage and actually passed it and justified it in some states on those grounds explicitly. There's been studies that have connected it to racism very deeply by going back to the original documents, and they're out and out arguing for kind of this white supremacist case for the minimum wage. Well, the interesting thing is, here we are 70, 80 years later, and the progressives, the labor interest, are still arguing for the minimum wage, but they've inverted their rationale. Now they're saying that it helps minorities and it helps workers on the lowest end. So it's the same policy, but they've just switched the language. They just switched the argument. And this is all coming out in contrast with we're getting really good empirical evidence in the last few years that minimum wages have a disemployment effect upon people that are at the margins of the workforce, so like fast food workers, teenagers that are at their first job, people that are in low-skilled and unskilled trades.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. It's such a great point about the genesis of the minimum wage idea. The basis for it was never about good economics, just like AOC's G&D isn't about good economics or good science. Right. It's always a power play. And, they can rewrite the genesis of their ideas, what was the basis for them, while they're rewriting history as it pertains to Kate Smith's musical compilations. It's just remarkable. It really is. Phillip Magness, he's a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. His piece to check out at their website, Climate Activism, an Ideology in Search of a Justification. Phillip, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to Dan and Amy on your smartphone. Download the AM560 mobile app today at 560 The Answer.